leo. We might make a start. Kia ora koutou katoa, haere mai ki te hiringa waka, ko Tom Noakes Duncan tōku ingoa. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this pānui on behalf of the Restorative Justice team here at Victoria University of Wellington. The events this year at Ihu Mātau have been described throughout the media as a lightning rod on the issue of Māori land rights. And whatever your view on this issue, it can hardly be denied that the conscience of this nation has in fact been stirred by these events, leading at least some to ask the question, what more is required for reconciliation to occur? Crown apologies and symbolic redress will not be enough to heal the many wounds of colonisation, nor can they alone inaugurate a new restored relationship in the many communities across Aotearoa. Alistair and the work of Karuwha Trust may not be a lightning rod. In fact, they are probably more like a dimmer light, often operating outside of the public eye, yet they have been working in communities across this land, gently illuminating the story that this land tells, and the responsibility of all of its inhabitants to seek a fuller experience of reconciliation, leading, hopefully, to a transformation of relationships, particularly between Māori and Pākehā, and how they see themselves and how they are in relationship to each other. So it's a privilege to have you here with us tonight, Alistair, sharing the story particularly of your journey with Tauranga Moana and how it has been pursuing reconciliation there. Now I'm going to pass to Sam Carpenter from Karuwha Trust shortly to formally introduce Alistair for those of you who don't know him. But I first need to point out that Alistair is in fact a farmer, which means that in order to return him home tonight, his journey will be long and we will need to be finishing here abruptly at 6:30. So we will be keeping to time tonight. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
He honore ki te atua, mau ngā rongo ki te whenua, whakaaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa, tihei wā Māori ora ki te whaiao ki te ao mārama. Kia ora tātou katoa, i te ahi nei. Ko Wakata te awa, ko Pukikoe te maunga, ko Bombay te waka, ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi. Nō reira, ko Sam Carpenter tōku ingoa. Kia ora tātou. As the Executive Chair of Karuwha Trust, I would like to thank Tom and the team here at the Restorative Justice Program for both arranging and hosting this lecture. I want to briefly outline what Karuwha Trust is and does, but very shortly I'll be handing over to Alistair because that's why you're here tonight, to hear him. Since we formed the Charitable Trust in 2005, we've been exploring the intersection of the faith story and the justice story in Aotearoa, New Zealand. In particular, we've been seeking to understand the history of the church and the mission's history and its interrelationship with the history of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the treaty. In sum, we want to understand the story that we are part of, and we hope to promote and foster that understanding generally in New Zealand and know the story you are a part of. This is obviously not just history for history's sake, although as an historian I entirely endorse that endeavour, but also is an essential prerequisite for reconciling our various stories, our various histories, our various experiences of what Aotearoa means, and as a foundation for doing justice and living justly in the present. Our main activity over the past 15 years or so has been taking groups of young people up to Waitangi over the February commemorations. We've done a number of things, explored historic sites with kaumātua and historians and descendants, participated in the commemorations obviously, and also helped to serve at the marae. Most recently we've facilitated a Waikato Wars sites haerenga, and we are planning in October our first haerenga to Taranaki and Parihaka, which is timed to chime in with the Te Pūtake o Te Riri New Zealand Wars commemorations. We're also in the early stages of planning other haerenga around the country, including to Tairāwhiti. We have the obligatory website and Facebook page, so please check us out on those if you're interested in finding out more about what we're doing or getting in touch with us, and the details are on the website. Ka tira, ka huri ki te kai kōrero mo te ahi nei, Alistair. Alistair Reese is one of our trustees, and I'm very happy to introduce him tonight. We can't actually, while he's a trustee of our trust, we can't actually take any credit for his journey over the last few decades really, in terms of history and justice and reconciliation endeavours. Alistair's been relating to a number of communities over that time, principally, if I can mention, Parihaka community, and also Tauranga Moana, where he resides. He has various degrees in theology, history and tikanga Māori, and most recently a PhD from the University of Wellington, focused on reconciliation and Pākehā identity. E te rangatira, tēnā koe, nau mai haere mai. So I'll hand over to Alistair.
How do you get this over, Tom?
That was my job.
Can you hear me up the top? Yeah. Noi hoa te whenua me one tini mea te ama ngā tangata katoa e noho ana I runga. Ko Kaituna te awa, ko Rangiru te maunga, ko Himalaya te waka, ko Waitangi te kawanata, ko Ihu Karaiti te tangata me te atua ti hei Māori ora. Ko te mihi tuatahi ki tō mātua e te rangi. E pā, ko takawhakawhetai tēnei ki a koe mo tēnei huihuinga he tēnei pō. Ko here atu ki ngā mana whenua, Taranaki upoko, Taranaki whānau ki te upoko o te ika, aroha mai. Ngā te toa, me ngā te raukawa, ko tēnei te mihi ki a koutou. Ki ngā mātā waka, kei wanganui a tātou e tēnei wā, tēnā koutou katoa. Ki ngā tangata tiriti, me ngā hau e whā, a tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Yes, Alistair Reese is my name, and it's a real privilege to be here. Ki a koe e te rangatira, Tom, he mihi whakawhetai tēnei ki a koe mō tō pauhiri ki a hau e tēnei pau. Thank you so much for your invitation, for being here. And to all of you that are here at the end of your busy days, no doubt, I'm amazed that you were here. Oh, you're all my friends who have come to fill up those seats, so I'm very grateful. Yeah, thank you. So tonight the subject is called Towards Reconciliation, Restoring the Heart of a City. So why have I chosen this topic? A little bit of background, as has been said already. I'm from, I live near Tauranga Moana. I am a farmer with a few other hats. And I live close to Tauranga City. And some years ago, and I was studying at university, studying tikanga Māori, and one of the kui said, you need to, I was at Waikato, and she said, you need to go and do some research on what your people did to my people in Tauranga Moana, which I sort of didn't really know much about. So I dutifully picked up her whittle and went and did some research. And that's a little bit of what I'll talk about tonight, what I discovered around Tauranga. And what I discovered in short was that there had been a miscarriage of justice. And so discovered that quite a few years ago, and I've been on a journey with a few people together with local hapu and others to try and see what we could do about that injustice. And at the same time, the City Council were launching a very glossy forecast of what the next 50 years were going to look like. It was called the Heart of the City project. So I thought it was rather ironic what this around the launching of a Heart of a City project and this deep mamai which I discovered, this deep hurt that was within the city. So it was the kind of the juxtaposition of these two things that set me to think about cities and the relationship between cities and their so-called heart, and asking obvious questions: are these literal are these literal hearts, or are they metaphysical hearts? So in short, it's not a profound statement really, but the conclusion is that cities are more than their physical infrastructure. I don't know if anyone read the Dominion this morning, but front page of the Dominion, there were 3 former mayors, and apologies, I don't know very much about Wellington politics. I don't know very much actually about Wellington at all, except on a good day it's really awesome, and today was one of those. But on that front page, these 3 mayors, former mayors, were talking about the heart of the city, and something needs to be done about the heart of the city. So I thought, as in Te Ao Māori we call this a tohu, so ke te mihi ki a koe. Mō tēnei, I'm just thanking somebody for that tohu. So in my travels, I've visited quite a few places, and one of them is a Soviet Union before it became Russia again. And one of the things you see in those places is there's lots of infrastructure, but in terms of what you would intuit, there wasn't a great deal of heart. I would say something about another city, was the city of Belfast. You go and the infrastructure is there to serve the purpose of what's happening. But again, you might ask, where is the heart of the city? And as I was preparing to share with you tonight, I was obviously Googling Wellington. And I came across this recently, a Stuff article which says that Wellington is a city with a broken heart, and talks about the civic square. And also, again, as I've already indicated, the articles that were on the Stuff this morning, the declarations by 3 former mayors that Wellington has lost its heart. Now, I'm not going to go into depth about Wellington, to be reassured, but I just wanted to contextualise a little bit of what I'm saying. The concept that I came across in Tauranga was, as I said, a very glossy, lot of money spent on the promotion of the city itself, and this is the image for the Tauranga heart of the city. This is what the artists and the people of Tauranga imagined, that there is the heart of the city. And it went on to say that the Tauranga City Council's Heart of the City project will see major investment and transformation in the city centre over the next few years. This will include the development of a new council administration building, as well as a revamped library and potentially an internationally branded hotel. This is in line with the city centre strategy, which seeks to establish the Tauranga City Centre as the commercial, civic and cultural heart of the region. You can see there that the vision of the council really equates the creation of buildings with the heart. My question about that is, I want to ask that what do these spaces What are the stories that these spaces tell? What are these constructions telling us about the places where they are being constructed and the people that they serve? They are not just created in a vacuum. Everything tells a story. It's whether you know it or not, there is an implicit or even an explicit story in the construction of these particular buildings. I want to suggest that the heart of a place is really about reconciling the stories that are within those places or within those spaces. There's an extraordinary book called If This Is Your Land, Where Are Your Stories? And this is a bit of a challenge to us. It's a Canadian book, and it tells the story of an encounter between an Indigenous people group and the Canadian Crown, and how the Crown was opposing, well, actually they were proposing a whole lot of development, and the Indigenous people were actually opposing that. And the Crown came up with their ideas, and the local people said, if this is your land, where are your stories? What story are you telling about your land? I could extrapolate that and I could say, what stories are we telling about our cities? What do our cities speak to us about in the spaces that we seek to create? Of course, I'm proposing that places and spaces, they have something that is actually living about them. Let me just quickly refer to this example here, Manga Pohatu. You will have heard of Ruakenana in the early part of the 1900s, and that kāinga of theirs, Ngai Tūhoi, was invaded. Nearly 100 years later, the Anglican Church went to them and they apologised for their part in terms of supporting the Crown in the invasion of Manga Pohatu. The kui, two different kui there said in response to the apology, something quite enigmatic to a European way of thinking: the land remembers. And then the other kui stood and she said, the mountain forgives. Absolutely, it's giving some kind of life to the places where these events took place. There is an intuition, I believe, that's even relevant, or it's even implicit within the statements of the councils which refer to the hearts of the city. There's an implicit understanding, even if it's not explicit, even if it's not rationally formalized, that actually a city has something within it that beats. In Te Ao Māori, there are a couple of whakatauki, which many of you will know, the very common one, which says, hea te mea nui e te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is the most important thing in the world? It is people, it is people, it is people. And then there's a kind of a contrasting whakatauki which says, whatangarangarau te tangata toi tū te whenua. The land disappears, the people disappear, but the land remains. You have this tension between the temporary nature of humanity and the permanence of the places where they're dwelling. What I propose is that actually there isn't a contradiction between those two things. Actually, it's the interaction between the people and the land that actually gives places and spaces their integrity and their meaning, and that the relationship between human occupation and the places where we dwell tells the story. It's the story then that is actually embedded in toi tū te whenua, in the memory of the land or in the memory of the places where we are dwelling. So that's within Te Ao Māori. Urban planners even understand and talk about these things. So this urban planner from the United States goes into some long description about all the different buildings and the infrastructures and the things that are the built environment upon the land. And then he goes on to say, cities evolve into not merely a built environment on top of a natural environment, but a living entity that we might easily call the soul or the heart of the city. So he's saying that the heart then is a metaphor for an unseen reality. It's something that is living, and it is something that is spiritual. The idea that cities or places have a soul or have a heart goes back a long time. I don't know when it first originated, except Plato in his formidable work, The Republic, suggests that cities have a soul in the same way that humans have a soul, or they have a heart in the same way that humans have a heart. So this commentator says the main interlocutors use the analogy of the city soul and the human soul to show the nature of justice and to prove that just people live better and are happier than unjust people by establishing a city to which justice is applied. Plato is suggesting that true justice creates a kind of health, and he equates justice with a healthy soul. So a just person has a healthy soul. Likewise, a just city has a healthy heart. That's Plato's thesis. So you can see where I'm moving here. The heart equates to justice. Justice equates to a heart. Well, I know there are people in the room who have a very long whakapapa in their research around justice. It would be right to say that justice is neither absolute or is it easily advisable. Easily identifiable. I want to talk and quote a couple of other whakatauki, proverbs from the Old Testament, and lead us on to the relationship between cities, justice, and then wisdom. And that's where we will end up in terms of talking about issues like ihu mātau. Out in the open, wisdom calls aloud. She raises her voice in the public square. On top of the wall, she cries out as at the city she makes her speech. Does not wisdom call and understanding lift up her voice? On top of the heights beside the way where the paths meet, she takes her stand. Besides the gates at the opening to the city, at the entrance of the doors, she cries out. Counsel is mine and sound wisdom. I am understanding. Power is mine. By me, kings reign and rulers decree justice. By me, princes rule and nobles all who judge rightly. I love those who love me, and those who diligently seek me will find me. Riches and honor are with me, enduring wealth and righteousness. My fruit is better than gold, even pure gold, and my yield better than choicest silver. I, wisdom, walk in the ways of righteousness in the midst of the paths of justice. So what the writer of those proverbs is saying is that wisdom is the thing that ultimately leads us into not only an understanding of justice, but actually the creation of justice. Wisdom says that heart of a city, or a heart of, is about place, people, and justice. The intersection of those three things is what these searchings, I guess, for this definition or this understanding lead us into. So where does wisdom sit in Aotearoa? I want to offer the fact that Te Tiriti o Waitangi is a wisdom strand in our land. It doesn't just come as an absolute. It's not just something that comes automatically. Somewhere in the imaginings of some people in in the 19th century, they imagined wisely that a treaty was an appropriate thing to have in Aotearoa, New Zealand in 1840. Wisdom understood something about land and the need for a treaty about land, which said something like the Queen agrees to protect the chiefs, the sub-tribes and all the peoples of New Zealand in the unqualified exercise of their lands, villages and all their treasures. Unfortunately, the wisdom of 1840 didn't linger. Waikato Chief Ngapora says, "If the blood of our people only had been spilled and the land remained, then this trouble would have been over long ago." Sam mentioned the commemorations on October 28, which is called Te Pūtaki o Te Rere, the source of the anger. The source of the anger is around the issue of the land. This is the wisdom that was neglected after 1860 particularly. Around that time, Māori began to use a motif again from the Old Testament, a motif which is called, a story that was called Naboth's Vineyard. And the reason I'm putting it in here is that it's central to the story around Tauranga Moana. So just very briefly, the Naboth's Vineyard story is that in the time of a king and queen called Ahab and Jezebel, there was a very successful vineyard owner. His name was Naboth. And Ahab, the king, coveted his land. So he goes down to Ahab and said, "Would you sell me or exchange me your land?" And Ahab's response is very interesting. He says, "Far be it for me to give you the inheritance of my ancestors." So Ahab goes back to his palace and he's moping around his palace, and Queen Jezebel comes up to him and says, "You know, what are you moping for, dear?" And he says, well, he tells her the story, and she says, "Don't worry, I'll fix it." So what she does is she goes down and she frames Naboth with the city elders, and they ultimately stone Naboth to death, and Ahab ends up with the land. Now that story is across the nation in the 19th century, and people from Otago, people from Canterbury, people from Waitara, people from Tauranga Moana, rangatira used that Naboth's vineyard, and they began to petition the crown to say, "Our land that you are taking from us is as Naboth's vineyard." Which leads me in to the Tauranga story. If you want to find out in more detail about it, it's on an Otago University website that I have a page on, and you can look it up. I won't go into the real details tonight, but I just want to give you enough background so that you are aware of the context of what I'm talking about. So the Church Missionary Society arrived in Tauranga around 1824, and they eventually negotiated the purchase of some land, which is called Te Papa. And of those of you that know Tauranga, this map demonstrates the extent of it. It's right down to the waterfront at one end, and it goes all the way down the main peninsula. And it's, as you can see on this, it's actually 1,300 acres in total. So that's how much land the missionaries purchased from local Māori. And so they held that land, and that was in 1838. They held that land right up until the 1860s, until the invasion of, in the 1860s, what we call the New Zealand Wars or the Land Wars, the invasion of Taranaki, Waikato, and then the troops actually invaded Tauranga, and they occupied this 1,300 acres. The reason they occupied the Taranaki lands, the Tauranga lands, was that they were wanting to cut off the supply lines for kingitanga. And so they took over that area, and they began to exercise their own controls over it, much to the dismay, actually, in the first instance of the missionaries that were there. So ultimately there were 3 major battles in the Tauranga region: the Battle of Gate Pa or Pukehinahina, the Battle of Tauranga, and then the Tauranga Bush Campaign, which was around the Pai Marere episodes when they were chasing the disciples of Te Uahomene around the Tauranga Hills. So the troops were there, they were engaged in that warfare. Local people were seeking to exercise their rights over their land, and ultimately the Crown troops overcame them. Now the Crown had ambitions for Tauranga for a couple of reasons. One, because it's just, if you've ever been there, it's a beautiful place for a start, beautiful climate, and a beautiful harbour. What more could I say? It's just beautiful. They also wanted it as a place of settlement for the new settlers that were coming in. The other thing was that they had a military strategy. They call it the Okati line between Tauranga and Raglan or Kawhia, and they wanted to establish military settlements across that line. They weren't so interested in the land to the south because that was less fertile, but the Waikato, Tauranga Bay of Plenty, and to the north was what they wanted to secure. So that the Crown at that stage began to put pressure on the Church Missionary Society to sell, and even before even before CMS came back with their answer, they began to do some surveying of the area. At that time, the Naboth's Vineyard began to emerge as a motif in Tauranga Moana. So this man, Alfred Brown, Archdeacon Brown, who was the resident missionary there, began to talk about this piece of land, this 1,333 acres, as being comparable to Naboth's Vineyard. And they were writing amongst themselves about that. One of the other bishops of the time, William Williams, who was also on the land board, also began to write and say, this land that we're on, it's just similar. It has every quality that the Naboth's Vineyard narrative has. And so that began to be talked about, obviously, within the Church Missionary Society. The parent company was back in England, and this was their response to the government overtures. Henry Venn wrote to Williams and he said, "This land was acquired and is retained under a solemn trust that it should be applied to the benefit of the native race and church, and that it should never be bartered or sold for the mere purpose of raising money. The natives who gave the land for the benefit of themselves, we therefore declined all offers. If the government need the land for public purposes, they may take it from us, but we shall then claim compensation." So in the first instance, the Missionary Society refused the request by the Crown for the Tauranga Moana land. But in a strange twist, eventually the Church Missionary Society capitulated. And I haven't got time to go into the nuance of it, and I apologise for that. It's a little more complicated than that, but ultimately they ended up gifting 4/5 of the Tauranga land to the Crown in exchange for 1/5 of the surveyed sections that could be kept by the Church Missionary Society. It was internal frictions within the society that led to that. So Te Papa Tauranga became known as Naboth's Vineyard. I want to say that, in my view, both the Crown and the Church Missionary Society were guilty. They were guilty on a number of accounts. They were guilty in the first instance. They were culpable, I guess, as you could say, for not consulting with Māori when the Crown came to them and asked for the land. There was a commission set up, the Godfrey Commission, and Māori opposed the sale of the land. This is the post-1840 commission that all lands went through in order to see whether the titles were justifiable or not. Many Māori opposed the sale in 1844, but the Godfrey Commission turned them down. They didn't hold to the original trust, and they didn't maintain their relational commitment to local hapu. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I want to argue that the Church Missionary Society could have refused the Crown overtures exactly as they stated in the first instance, and they could have continued in their prophetic task to speak out against injustice. I also want to offer the fact that the Crown had a fiduciary duty of care to honour the relational transaction between CMS and tangata whenua. There was a song in 1985, I think it was Jefferson Starship, my friend Bruce will know. I think they talked about San Francisco and saying, "We built this city on rock and roll." People are saying now that Tauranga was a city that was built on betrayal, the betrayal of trust. I was recently in Canada. A former Governor General there said, "When the present does not recognise the wrongs of the past, the future takes its revenge. For that reason, we must never turn away from the opportunity of confronting history together, the opportunity to right an historical wrong." We went to the church quite a few years ago and pleaded the case. It took 15 years for the church to come to a place of actually accepting a responsibility for this. And I want to acknowledge them. I want to acknowledge the leadership of the three tikanga of the Anglican Church. And in December of last year, the archbishops gathered under the auspices of the two local hapu, Ngai Tamarawaho and Ngāti Tapu, and offered their apology, their acceptance of the fact that yes, they betrayed the trust that they had with their ancestors. It was a momentous occasion. Tears flowed. It had taken also some time to lead up to that, and I was involved in some of the meetings between the church and iwi leaders, and it was really some really hard talk, some really poignant talk, lots of laughter and lots of tears, but resulted in this occasion. I say that the Anglican apology is towards reconciliation. To say that an apology is sufficient sells the situation short. An apology, in my view, is the gateway. It's the beginning of communications that then opens the way to say, where shall we go from here? So this is an aerial map of a part of Tauranga City. I'm amazed around the green spaces around Wellington, as I've been here for a couple of days. In Tauranga, our historical places are these fragile little spots. It's like they just cling on in the midst of the encroaching settlement that has just continued relentlessly since 1838. The little spots that actually speak the narratives of who the city is and who the people are, those places have been bulldozed, roaded over, little historical sites are shoved, they're in the back there somewhere, you have to search them out. The tide is turning and there is some little monuments now in some of the places at least. But what does the restoration of Tauranga City look like? And so these are the discussions that we're in with Hapu now, post-apology. I rero whenua atu, me hoki whenua mai. It's one of the catch cries, is that it was land that was taken in the first place, therefore it must be land that is given back. This is kind of like, that's the call, that's the cry for justice, that's the cry for from the heart of many, the cry that would actually equate to some form of reconciliation. So we are in negotiation. It will be with the Crown and it will be with the Council about some land that will actually hopefully satisfy some of that cry. As I said, Naboth's vineyard is a motif now that has actually been exercised up and down the Motu, in the South Island and in the North Island. How, as a nation, have we responded to Naboth's vineyard? One of the ways that we've responded is with the Treaty of Waitangi Act in 1975 and then its amendment in the 1985. Because we only got a short time, I'm going to be a little bit crude. I'm going to say that it's a helpful, but it's actually a blunt instrument. That the Waitangi Act is a blunt instrument. Why is that? Because it doesn't fully meet Te Pūtaki o Te Rere. It doesn't meet this relationship between identity and land and the cry of the people for something around this land. The other thing I want to just put in here for a thought is that the Waitangi settlements have actually had little impact upon the wider society. One of the things that I've been really sorrowful about is that it's almost like that I don't want to minimise the treaty settlements. They've been an extraordinary thing. I'm just going to come to say they're not enough. That's all. That's where we'll end up. It's been a sadness is that it's almost like they've been a sealed process between the Crown and different hapu, different iwi around the settlements. And the majority of us as a Kiwi population, we live our lives and we read about it in the paper. We might see, the second or third reading on the TV or something, and some people might say, oh, that's good, or there might be a lot of grumbling. But essentially, what I'm saying is that there's been an extraordinary lost opportunity for us as a people, as a majority people I'm talking about here, mainly Pākehā, to actually be engaged in the process of understanding about this reconciliation attempt by the Waitangi Tribunal, and then of course the different governments that have instituted the findings of the Waitangi Tribunal. So we actually haven't lived amongst the mamai. We actually haven't lived and understood what it is about the land that would cause us to engage with our hearts, that we too might be able to progress within that healing and reconciliatory movement. So just briefly returning back to the Tauranga situation, what is needed? We cannot repeat or restore what was there. But I want to say that it's an involvement of the entire society in Tauranga that will be needed in order to get across the line the kind of things that we need. It will need the church to continue its courage. It will need the Church Missionary Society to continue with its commitment. Perhaps one of the biggest obstacles will be the Tauranga citizens themselves. Can I just share one little thing to give you an idea of the opposition to this kind of reparation or this kind of process? The council had offered one section of land back to the Church Missionary Society. There's a museum there. But then they changed their mind in an enlightened moment. Many of us thought and said, we'll actually give it to the hapu. And the hapu had agreed to give it on a 99-year peppercorn lease to the mission station. So a lot of the people were seeing it as a win-win. And then some people metaphorically stormed into the council meeting and opposed it. So the council backtracked and said, oh, I think we need to have some submissions on this now. At one of the recent submissions, one of the people who was opposing this stood up and said, if you do this here in Tauranga, you will have a Christchurch on your hands. That will be the repercussions. And by that they were talking about the Christchurch massacre. That's what they were saying. If you do that, those are the kind of things that will result. So to bring people across the line to actually understand and to be involved in this kind of process is huge, and I don't underestimate that. It'll need something from the Tauranga Council, it'll need something from the Crown, but most of all it'll need something from Tauranga Moana iwi, who, regardless of the outcome, will be having to say at the end of the day, it's not what it was, but it's what it is. And whatever is in their hearts, that will extend to reconciliation. I didn't know that ihu mātau would be talked about at the beginning. We're talking about hearts of a city. We're talking about the relationship between justice and a heart, and we're talking about the relationship between wisdom and justice and a heart. I've made a bold statement and maybe a bit of a brash statement, excuse the pun, about I lost my train there. I made a bold statement about the Waitangi legislation as being a blunt instrument. My sense is that where we're at as a nation right now is going to require wisdom. That where we are placed is different than where we were placed in 1985. That we will find ourselves as a nation dealing with this issue of land particularly. The other thing will be the issue of rangatiratanga, but putting that out to one side for the moment. Tonight we're really just talking about land. But the issues of land that are particularly connected to identity. I think that we are being totally over-optimistic if we think that which was finished with the Waitangi Tribunal claims means that we are now at a place where everything is done and dusted. As an outsider, that's my view of what's happening at ihu mātau. Without going into the minutiae of the different things, this is how I understand it, is that the mamai, the pain still resides in different pieces of land. In Tauranga Moana, the city council want to make some very bold statements and plans about the heart of the city and the going forward and building all these things, but the mamai still sits deep within the whenua of that Te Papa Peninsula. And it's as if some of these new buildings, whether it's if a new library or a new museum or a new council building is suddenly, that sits on this mamai, is going to create a heart. I said to the council, I think we need a heart transplant actually around some of these things. If a heart equates to justice, if the heart of a city is around the narrative of our stories and the justness or the unjustness of those things, there is no simple one-size-fits-all sweep over that will say, now we've got it fixed. If I return to the proverb, it's like wisdom who sits in the city gates, wisdom who sits in the streets and cries out. This is what we need to create a city heart. It's these things that will contribute to our ability to be able to create something that is unique and living in the places where we dwell. So I just put this up today. What is the key to Wellington's heart? I sat today in the city square, Pingako, which is an attempt to, I think, to create some some justness to that living space. What's happening in Tauranga and the processes that we are involved there and that has taken all these years will be different here in Wellington. It's a prophetic task, I call. It's the task of discernment of what is it about this whenua? What is it about these people that have lived historically here? What are the stories of this place? What are the stories that actually need to be reconciled in order that Wellington might truly have a heart that is more than a new art gallery or a new city library or any of those things, which is not to minimise what those things are. They're all important. But unless they are built upon a foundation of a living soul, then it will continue to be fraught. Let me just finish with this taonga, or this of potatota whero ko tahi te koao o te ngira e kuhuna ai te miro mā, te miro pango, te miro whero I muri kia mau ki te aroha, ki te ture, ki te whakapono. Through the eye of the needle past the white threads, the black threads and the red threads. Afterwards, looking to the past as you progress, hold firmly to your love, the ture, the law, and your faith. Nā reira, kua mutu anai nei tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you so much, Alistair. We do have some time for some questions or very brief comments or statements. So, does anyone have a question?
Yep. Thank you, Alistair. I'm aware in thinking about the narco of this city, just to the street running alongside Civil Street is Wakefield Street. And the irony of the main thoroughfare named after a scurrilous land grab. Whether there needs to be a reconsideration of street names. Part of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's an obvious discussion point. I want to underscore what I say is that we opened Pandora's box. None of this is going to be easy, and I don't think there are any absolute right or wrongs on it. We have the discussions around what do we do with old monuments and all of those sorts of things. We see that being played out, particularly in the US right now, and obviously the discussion is relevant here. We are changing. I think you'll see that there are councils actually have more of an appetite, not to call things Cypress Avenue or whatever, those sorts of things in the new subdivisions necessarily. I think one of the kaumātua we said back home is that one of the things he said that we're afraid of is that we're losing our footprint on the land. And so, and I think in terms of those names, it's about how do we judiciously, creatively, graciously evolve into that understanding of our bicultural heritage and particularly our commitments to Tiriti.
I just wanted to ask a question regarding having undertaken this work that you've done. Can you talk to us a little bit about how your relationship with Tauranga has changed from your experience prior to undertaking this work, your relationship with the city, and now how you look at the city now?
Yeah, thank you. I hope everybody here that question is asking about how my relationship changed with Tauranga. Well, one of the joys is actually being connected to people of the land, people who preceded me and my family, and have deep roots, and so being I guess welcomed into those stories. when I stood at the beginning and I said, ko Waitangi te kawanata, it means, so Waitangi is the covenant. So for me, Waitangi is my tūranga waiwai. It's the place where I can stand, as Eddie Jury says, it's a place that I can stand with an integrity that has been given to me. I use that analogy in response to your question. There's a sense, and you know, we're talking about some kind of amorphous things, aren't we? Metaphysical things. I know in a secular society it's difficult to talk about these things, but anyway, I will anyway. It's about feeling. I sat in the hut in the square today, and I'm a visitor. I didn't feel very much. So what does that say to me? I feel Tauranga, and I weep in Tauranga. My tears hit the land in Tauranga. So there's a way that I have now a deeper emotional connection into that place. I think the other thing, why I mentioned the sorrow I feel about the Waitangi processes and the fact that many of my Pākehā family have not been involved in actually being in that, is they're missing out on actually feeling some things around the land. That being part of that process, I think, would enable us to go forward in a sacrificial way. And I'll just conclude this to say that I don't think there's a rightful, just outcome for these things unless there is sacrifice. That there will be a sacrifice that will be, it's not a forceful sacrifice, but I think a willing sacrifice that we as individuals, families, and institutions are willing to make, to do whatever wisdom tells us is the right thing. Long answer to your question.
Alistair, you've left us not only with some thoughts, but I suppose your story as it is full of integrity, and the path that you have taken, not only for yourself but for many others, leading towards that healing journey. So I'm really, I feel blessed to be able to have heard you tonight, as many here will have as well. But also I think you've raised a really big challenge. As you said before, the tohu that is with us in terms of the question around the heart of this city, and even your experiences here in the last couple of days, I think raises some challenging questions for us here. So I thank you for bringing that as well. So, okay, kia ora. We just say thank you again.